So let's talk about trees. So in the foreground, trees are not just one cylinder, but many. Especially if you're drawing a tree in the foreground, it's probably going to be an important tree, which means that you're probably going to be drawing an older tree. Trees will change depending on their age, obviously. If you've got a younger tree, it's probably going to be that one cylinder type deal, which is like not as fun, right? If we want to draw that kind of like bigger, sort of old, ancient, fantastical tree, you can think of them as if you got a bunch of pool noodles stuck together, right? They're actually a bunch of cylinders. This is how we get our chunky tree texture. Again, if you think of like an older tree, right? Think of those like old ancient trees. They've got those spiraling branches. They've got that really thick trunk. You're probably not just gonna draw a single cylinder and then a bunch of branches on it and then the leaves, right? Gets kind of boring, a little bit old, right? You're gonna want that tree to look a little more interesting. You're gonna want that tree to feel more filled out, right? So rather than draw our tree, right, if we've got like, we're gonna talk about the trunk for a second. We've got our tree, and then we've got in our other cylinders for the branches, right? Then one cylinder down here, this, right? This is fine, but it's not interesting. The funky thing with trees is that trees can also have a line of action. Everything has a line of action. If you think about it, there's almost nothing that you will draw that will not have a line of action unless it is meant to be super, super stock stiff and not moving at all. Trees are organic. They are not man-made. So adding in that sort of line of action, adding in that sort of gestural quality to a tree makes it more interesting. So if I was to change this sort of trunk here, let's say that I want a kind of winding tree. Let me give it that sort of S curve. And then again, I think of it as a bunch of cylinders rather than one. Let's add in a bunch of different size cylinders in there. Follow our line of action a little bit. Maybe we have another cylinder coming out the back here, and then more gnarled roots, more gnarled branches. And then with these cylinders, right, we've got a bunch of these cylinders kind of going on. We could now use these to bump up the forms of the tree itself. Again, we can think of like a bunch of rings going around parts of the tree. It gives us our 3D-esque nature. Obviously, it doesn't have to be this uniform. Probably shouldn't be. You can make these cylinders different shapes. You can make them different sizes. You can make them different positions. They don't all have to be next to each other. You can twist them. You can mangle them. You can make them a little bit funkier. Bark, however, if we really want to get into drawing the wood of a tree, bark. If we notice, while we look at these, hey, there's a lot of cracks kind of going along the wood here, right? It creates almost these weird rectangular patterns kind of going on in the wood, but we also notice these sort of ridges that help define the 3D-like forms of this wood, right? The ridges, the edges that sort of help tell us, okay, how curved is this? How much movement is in this? How much movement within the bark, how this bark is growing on top of itself, what's sort of cracking and shaping the forms of the trees, right? So tree bark carries many, many cracked textures, right? Emphasizes the curved nature of the wood. This is what gives our bark texture. Now, I'm not saying you're gonna draw in every single little crack, right, ever. I'm not saying that you're gonna like have every single little piece of wood, you're gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna break in like the bark like this, and we're gonna draw in all of these cracks. Like, I'm not saying that you do this. Maybe if you've got a close-up shot and you want the tree to be really, really visible, you want this bark to be like really, really like close up, you could totally do that, right? If you want this bark to be like studied, or you want somebody to like be ripping off a piece or whatever, yeah, you can totally do that. But if you're drawing like a full tree, that's probably not going to be great in the long run. So everybody kind of approaches this differently. Me personally, the way that I draw a tree with its bark, all right, again, let me kind of pull up draw a really quick tree form. Y'all are lucky. I drew a tree like 3 days ago. I drew a really big mangled tree because we fought a tree in D&D, and I got to draw a tree. I was so happy. So I'm like, I've got recent practice in with a tree, with a properly detailed tree. So let's say we've pulled up like a tree form, kind of doing this magic real quick. Right? This is fine, right? Totally cool, right? We can sort of tell that's a funky form of a tree, but if we want to bring in that wood texture, right, what we can do, what I personally tend to do, is I emphasize the forms of my branches by doing this, because that already naturally happens with this bark and the way that it breaks and stuff like that. So doing this sort of like hatching around the form of the tree gives it that faux bark feel. What I used to do when I was younger as well is I would add in, like every once in a while like that, to curve around the branches as well. And that also gives it a fun sort of texture, I think, if you use both in combination. But it's a very similar approach to how I would tell somebody to draw, say, like bricks or like stone masonry or something like that, right? I'm not drawing in every single little detail possible. I'm drawing in enough to where we can make the assumption that this is a repeated texture over and over and over, right? It's not so much to where it feels overwhelming, but it's enough to where we can be like, oh, yeah, okay, so this is kind of just a thing that's gonna be going on throughout this entire form, this entire piece. Right? Look at that. That was minutes. Right? Didn't even take that long. And it's very, very effective. It gives us a nice sort of hefty feeling bark of a tree. Don't forget a bunch of holes on the trees, places that you can add in little branches maybe. Maybe there's tiny little branches that are coming off as well. Right? Isn't that funky? Isn't that nice? I love drawing trees. Can you tell I love drawing trees? Right, and I think that looks pretty neato. If it's in like a grassy area as well, you can like put in some grass. The edges of the branches as well. The edges of the roots, which gives it a nice sort of feel as if it's like solidified in the ground. Grass is sort of growing around it. Right, less is more. Enough detail to give the textural impression, not too much to where it feels busy. And then leaves. Again, my personal technique for drawing leaves. Right, if we are lining in leaves, we're not gonna make each bump really equal. Right, this is too even. We're also not gonna draw each individual leaf because I don't want you to die. And I don't want you to feel like you're dying. Like, yeah, we've got some difference in texture here, but this is way too much. And you notice how long it's taking me as well. I'm getting bored already. It's been like, what, 3 seconds? I don't want to do this anymore. So the general rule of thumb, when I draw in leaves, I tend to mix these two. I want this more uneven sort of texture of these leaves with the more simplicity of this one. So we're going to change up the texture again. Add in a couple more inner details, enough detail to give the textural impression, but not too much to where it feels busy. We can even add a couple leaves popping out like this. This is very cartoony, but I enjoy doing that. And this gives us a nice sort of filled in, but not too filled in look, I think. You can use a very similar technique for clouds, but clouds you're probably gonna have bigger bumps by comparison, and then a flat bottom, which also looks a little bit nicer. And if we combine the two, let me take this bark because I don't want to draw it again. If we combine the two of these, let me pull this, add some branches in. Because we are using this like texture to emphasize the 3D-ness of the tree, we need to keep track. Because we are using the tree texture to keep track of the forms of this tree, we also need to keep track of the general space and the perspective that these branches and that the tree keep up, right? You're noticing the difference in my curves as I add in these sort of textury hatching, right? I change up the curves and how they go, what directions they go in, depending on where they are in the branch, right? Because if let's say I switched this one out, right? And I made them all curve up this way, this branch suddenly feels a lot different, right? So we want to make sure that we are keeping track of those curves and where those curves are going to get the correct perspective of the tree that we are illustrating. And with branches, if we're putting them into the leaves, we can just cut them off like that. I'm gonna have them disappear into the foliage. You notice how loose I am working with this. Trees and a lot of more organic material tends to look better when it is a little bit messier, actually. So something a little more sketched, a little more rushed, less clinical tends to look a little bit nicer in my eyes. Ta-da! Tree! Isn't that nice? Isn't that funky? We love drawing trees in this house. I love drawing trees in this house. Other than the fact that I've mentioned it, like, every 5 seconds within this lesson. What's really cool is that this leaf texture, again, works for clouds, works for hair. But yes, so that is trees in the foreground. This is if you are drawing a tree and you're like, I want this tree to be the center of attention. I want this tree to be right there and I want people to focus on it, right? Or maybe my character's leaning up against this tree and it's a really big, like, long shot and I want them to be, like, in the forefront. So this is what those kind of trees look like. This is a good looking tree. Videos like these wouldn't be possible without our Patreon members, helping us grow closer towards our goal of making arts education free and accessible for everyone. For as little as $2 a month, you can get real-time feedback on your artwork, class recordings, access to private Discord channels where you can chat with the instructors, and more. Pledge today and level up your practice. Let's talk about them in the background, which is going to take significantly less time. When we are drawing trees in the background, more likely than not, you're probably drawing something in color. Probably working on something where you just need a really quick, simple background and like the person's in a forest or like the person's walking on a trail. There's a couple trees in the background and you're like, oh man, I gotta draw some trees, but like I don't want to draw like the full thing. And like, of course you don't have to. You want to keep it simple. You want to focus on the silhouette of the tree. So let me give a really quick example. Again, let me work in exact, like, only color, like as if I am mimicking a kind of background here. Let's say that I want to draw on my tree. Bark, by the way, try not to make your bark super bright brown. Like, try not to make it super, like, saturated. It actually tends to look better if you go through the middle to the left. You want to kind of lean to those grays, and they tend to look a little bit nicer. If you want to make it a bit more rich, keep it in the center. Like, the center of, like, your hue cube is all you need. Like, keep it to the middle, 50% saturation is all you need. Any more than that, and it feels like an MS Paint drawing. So, try not to make it too saturated. Unless the whole piece is super saturated. But, like, if you are drawing just, like, a standard tree, do not go all the way over there. For drawing in a tree, right, I'm gonna kind of draw this in. See, we've got our tree going on. I'm drawing all these funky little branches. And I should have done the leaves first. Again, picking greens, don't actually pick green. This is going to look super radioactive. Even if you go in the center, it's going to still look super radioactive. You're actually going to want to lean towards yellow. Yellow, I find, yellowy green tends to look a little bit nicer, feel a little bit more natural. If I really want like a really green, I tend to go to like a lime. Like, this is the max green I tend to go. Like, I'm never to the top right, but like this is the max like green that I tend to go. Average tree that I tend to draw is like around here-ish usually. Around there-ish or like here maybe. It just tends to look a little bit nicer. Let's say I draw in like what I said before. These funky little leaves every once in a while. We have our branches. Right, maybe I want to add a little bit more inner detail, not too much, but I want to add some inner detail in here. So we want to add in some of that inner detail, add in some of that funky shading. And then maybe I want to add some detail to the bark, match a little bit, add a little thing in there. You know, again, give it some detail, give it some, you know, all that. This is too much. This is too much. Right, this tree is going to be in the background. You don't need to do this much. You're doing too much with this. You know what you need if you're drawing a tree in the background? You need the general shape of the greenery. Very general shape of the greenery. And then like that. And then like maybe like a branch or two. Maybe you want to add in just a smidge. Like maybe you just want to do that. That's it. Farther back you go, the less detail you need. So let me take a couple of examples from some pages I've done recently, because you gotta draw a lot of trees. If you're gonna draw a forest, you gotta draw a lot of trees. And when you are drawing, like, trees or, like, background foliage or anything like that, do you notice here, I didn't even draw in the branches in this panel. There's just the leaves, and you can kind of understand that these are trees just from looking at this. You sort of just get the gist that these are trees. Same over here. It's like you kind of just get the gist that there are trees back here. This is foliage, and it's blue tinted because of atmospheric perspective, right? You sort of just get that gist. Even in this one, where you get a lot of trees, a lot of foliage down here, super simplified. I didn't even draw in the leaves up top. I just made the entire background this foresty green, and then just drew in the trunks, which were like 5 lines each. Like, it was like, you know? And then the foliage on the ground, which I kind of wanted a sort of lily paddy vibe to it. Do you notice how these trees just sort of blend into the background a little bit? And it makes it all sort of feel just a little more blended in. It doesn't feel like too much, doesn't feel like too little, because In all honesty, nobody's gonna look at it. It's a tree, nobody's gonna pay it too much mind, right? It is a tree that nobody's really gonna notice, so try not to, you know, kick yourself over too much detail. The farther back you go, the less detail you need, so less is more when drawing trees in the background. Just a little bit of color is all you need. That joke, you kind of draw 5 things, you know how to draw everything. Branches have a very similar process to cracks and lightning. If you want to use your non-dominant hand, you can draw in branches and get a really, really natural, nice look. If you're not really great, I've kind of got a trained sort of look for how branches look, but if you sort of struggle with that, I'm using my left hand right now, use that to sort of give yourself a nice gnarled branch look. And you can use your dominant to go back in and fix it up a smidge. Or if you are ambidextrous, take your pen, hold it all the way from the back on the eraser, and I'm using my dominant right now, but this forces you to, again, sort of get a kind of gross, scraggly line. And then you go back in, use your pen as normal, and fix it up a little bit. Right? Really funky, really, really simple, really easy way to get a sort of natural, gnarled vibe to it. Join a virtual class in seconds and learn live from professional artists. Enjoy weekly assignments, individual guidance, and real-time feedback on your artwork so you can create like a fearless illustrator. If you learned something new, please like and share this with a fellow art nerd. If you love receiving quality and free arts education, subscribe. Here's a couple other videos you can check out next.